Okay, so our group is doing a presentation on Gilded Age Monopolies, and we'll start off with the background. So, the post-Civil War era was a time when there were many innovations and new technologies, and one of these was oil. Oil revolutionized the way that people lighted their homes, fueled their vehicles, and powered their industries. Another one of these innovations was the production of steel. This came from a want for railroads, and before the Civil War, railroads were made from iron. After the Civil War, with the development of factories and the need for more transportation in the U.S., the high cost of iron limited the production and strength that was necessary for the railroad's development. Steel was much more durable than iron, and by the mid-19th century, iron had reached the top of its development. Steel appeared to be a possibly good choice for the railroads. However, at the time of the Civil War, the most common form of steel was blister steel, and it required many hours of hard work and was an expensive process that did not produce large quantities. Henry Bessemer came up with a process for steel production that was much more commercially viable, and as more and more steel factories adapted to it, the production of steel exploded. In 1867, Bessemer's invention produced 2,000 tons of steel. In 1876, it produced 470,000 tons of steel, and in 1886 it produced more than 2 million tons, and nearly all of it went to build steel rails for the railroad. Although between 1880 and 1900 the American iron and steel production more than tripled, overall rail production did not follow the same trend. This caused steel producers to look for other markets, and American cities had a strong appeal. One of these reasons is that cities wanted to build skyscrapers, and skyscrapers needed a strong material like steel to build their structure. Overall, America's emergence as one of the largest industrial powers was led by its production of the highly versatile resource of steel. Some other innovations of the time were Thomas Edison's light bulb in 1878, which caused a large need for power and electricity that would be able to power cities and large amounts of people. Alexander Bell was granted a patent for the telephone in 1876, and his Bell Telephone Company dominated the telephone industry. There was also a large amount of urbanization. There was a lot of immigration at the time due to the availability of jobs at factories and mines. Due to the unprecedented influx of people, cities were overcrowded and there was limited housing. Urban residents experienced poor lighting, heating, sanitation, and medical care, and skyscrapers were developed to fight these issues. They allowed urban populations to efficiently expand vertically. The importance of all of these details is that many large businesses use these innovations to exponentially scale and become monopolies or trusts. So that brings us to our second topic, which is the monopolies. So first of all, what is a monopoly? A monopoly is formed when a business consolidates or strengthens their market position by eliminating their competition. A corporation would form a trust which buys a majority of the stock of smaller businesses in its market, allowing the corporation to have control over the smaller companies. The trusts or monopolies have so much power and dominance over other companies that they can control the prices of their products and do not have to try to beat their competitors, mostly because competition does not and cannot exist. Monopolies would normally buy companies that allow them to do everything they need without outsourcing or buying products from other companies in order to maximize their profits. So, why the Gilded Age? At the beginning of the 19th century, large corporations and large businesses did not exist. Many businesses were family-owned or had few employees. The Gilded Age was a time of extreme industrialization, urbanization, and innovation. This means that businesses either had or could build the tools they needed, such as factories. They had the people to work in the factories and an environment to create products to make profit off of. The stock market also became much more popular, which allowed corporations to be financed and have a lot of money to use. Some monopolies of the time were the Standard Oil Company, which was the first large monopoly of the Gilded Age, which was owned by John D. Rockefeller and controlled 95% of the petroleum refining industry during the Gilded Age. At its peak, Standard Oil Company fully owned 14 other companies and had majority stock ownership in at least 24 others. The Andrew Carnegie Steel Company was owned by Andrew Carnegie, and due to the harsh working conditions at one of Carnegie Steel Company's factories, there was a strike which turned violent. Carnegie's manager at the plant, Henry Frick, hired strikebreakers to replace the lost work, but the workers on strike would not let the new workers into the factory. The company responded by hiring armed private security to protect the replacement workers, and when the security arrived, a gun battle began, killing both security and workers. The monopolies had huge amounts of power and could do almost anything as they pleased. Carnegie Steel controlled about 70% of the United States steel industry. Another monopoly was the J.P. Morgan Bank. J.P. Morgan owned many steel companies and eventually bought Carnegie's share of the Carnegie Steel Company for more than $250 million at the time, and adjusted for inflation in 2021, that would be $8.3 billion. Morgan combined his previously owned steel companies with the Carnegie Steel Company to form the United States Steel Company, which is still around today. Other monopolies include American Can, Continental Tobacco, General Chemical, International Harvester, National Biscuit, Union Bag and Paper, and their names are pretty self-explanatory. This is a picture essentially showing the type of power that Standard Oil Company had. It had control of the bank, had control of the shipping, the railroads. You can see it's almost like it has arms in all of these different places at once, and that's truly how a monopoly would be.
Effects of monopolies. So I'll be explaining the effects of monopolies during the Gilded Age, including the benefits and drawbacks. So to begin with the benefits, some benefits were how monopolies helped consumers gain more products and helped investors to make more money. It financed technological advances and created many unskilled jobs. It educated people who could make money working management positions and also created a middle class. Big businesses were beneficial to investors, and although free commerce was limited, generally prices of the same products went down and consumers benefited from this. Corporations contributed to large economic growth by developing new goods and services as the result of technological innovation that a smaller company could not afford to finance. Big businesses created modern business practices such as integrated operations and mass production. Many jobs were created for unskilled workers, many of which were immigrants, and allowed them to somewhat provide for their families on that low salary that they were gaining. Before corporations, there were not many middle-class people. Most were either part of higher or lower classes. Middle management jobs were created at corporations and allowed educated but now necessarily high-class people to make more money and live better and more profitable lives. Because of this, there became many more people in what is now known as the middle class. Some drawbacks of monopolies during the time included how large companies would often rely on making government connections in order to secure their operation. Small businesses tended to lose a lot of power and ability to make money. Workers had no power over employers, while workers dealt with dangerous equipment, long working hours, and low pay, which was the effect for the chase of great profits. By the early 1900s, nearly 1% of the population of the U.S. controlled 75% of all wealth, while millions of people lived in poverty. Although there were philanthropists such as Andrew Carnegie, who donated over $300 million of his own money, many more of the top 1% showed off their wealth by building large houses and justified their ways through the concept of social Darwinism, which supported the survival of the fittest and blamed the lower classes for their own misery. The image on the left shows a worker during the Gilded Age, and it presents the poor working conditions of the time. This image on the right is Cornelius Vanderbilt's house, and it expresses the difference between the riches and poor people back then.
Reformations. The Interstate Commerce Act allowed Congress to regulate railroad rates due to many small businesses and farmers protesting that railroad companies charged them higher rates than larger corporations. Approved on July 2, 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was the first law to discourage trusts and monopolies. The act states it is illegal for companies to limit trade and regulates large businesses on a federal level. Approved on October 15, 1914, the Clayton Antitrust Act prohibited anti-competitive mergers. The law also made strikes, boycotts, and labor unions legal under federal law. Oftentimes, the Clayton Act reimbursed the Sherman Act in terms of how businesses were formerly run. The Federal Trade Commission Act, or FTC Act, banned the unfair methods of trade within businesses, and this act held businesses accountable for controlling one area of trade. Elected in 1901, Roosevelt believed that it was important to distinguish between good trusts and bad trusts, and greatly supported the regulation of monopolies and businesses. The effect of reformations. Knight was a sugar monopoly and became the first interpretation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case began when the E.C. Knight Company gained control over the American Sugar Refining Company, and by 1895, the companies controlled 98% of the sugar refining industry. Therefore, the company was charged with violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. With the Supreme Court in favor of this case, it showed that there was still a strong want for a non-regulated economy at the time. At this time, many monopolies tried to simply work around the regulated laws, and due to limited amount of support in the government, most of the regulations were ineffective.
Google entered into many agreements with other software hardware companies that would forbid the pre-installation of any competing search service. Specifically on mobile devices, in addition to its pre-installation, Google also made its search engine undeletable regardless of consumer preference. One of these companies was Apple, and Google became the default search engine of Safari browser and other Apple search tools. One important characterization of Google is that it uses its profits made from search engine monopolization to secure its position even further, therefore creating an endless cycle of monopolization and making it nearly impossible for competitors to get a market share. This limit in competition greatly affects consumers because new companies cannot develop an accessible innovation to reduce. Is the main way that Google makes money is through advertising. So the companies advertising on Google can also be looked at as consumers. They are also forced to use Google if they want to advertise on a search engine to do not have options in prices from other companies.
There are still many other present-day companies similar to Google and its monopolistic business practices, such as Amazon and its dominance in the online retail industry, Facebook and its dominance in social media. Overall, the effect of the Gilded Age business practices in modern day are enormous. Gilded Age monopolies created the future of business in America, and that's not necessarily a good thing.